For 4 years, nobody knocked on this old man's door. When someone finally did, they uncovered a life nobody on the street could have imagined. Behind those curtains was a man everyone had forgotten. But the truth was, James had lived a life more extraordinary than most people ever will, and he almost took every bit of it with him. James was 79 years old and had lived in the same house for 51 years. He had moved in with his wife Margaret when they were young. Together they painted the front door red. Together they planted roses in the garden. Together they built a life inside those walls. Then Margaret died. And after that, James slowly disappeared from the world without ever leaving his home. He stopped answering the door, not because he was rude, not because he disliked people. He just couldn't see the point anymore. The neighbors noticed. Lights on late at night, bottles left outside, the occasional shadow behind the curtains. But no one knocked. Everyone was busy. Everyone had their own lives, their own problems, their own reasons for leaving it until tomorrow. And tomorrow turned into years. James lived like that for 11 years. Quiet, forgotten, invisible. Until a woman named Priya moved in next door. She was 28, living with her husband and their 2-year-old daughter. She was new to the street, which meant she didn't know the one rule everyone else had accepted. Don't bother the old man at number 14. One afternoon, Priya baked too many biscuits. That was it. No grand plan. She just had extra biscuits, put them in a tin, walked next door, and knocked. Then she waited. It took a long time for the door to open. When it finally did, James stood there in an old cardigan, cautious, tired, and slightly confused. His eyes were still sharp. He looked at Priya the way someone looks at something they stopped expecting a long time ago. She smiled, held out the tin, and said, "I just moved in next door. I made too many. I thought you might like some." James stared at her for a moment. Then he said something Priya would never forget. "Nobody has knocked on this door in 4 years. Not to chat, not to check on him, not for any reason at all. 4 years. Priya came back the next week, then again the week after that. At first it was simple. Tea, biscuits, small talk. The weather, her daughter's latest word. Ordinary little conversations. But slowly, James began to open up. And what he told Priya next made her realize she had been walking past an extraordinary life without ever knowing it. James had not lived an ordinary life at all. For 22 years, he had worked as a code breaker for British intelligence. But somehow that wasn't even the part that shocked her most. Not the movie version, the real version. He spent the Cold War decoding intercepted messages from behind the Iron Curtain, working in rooms that officially didn't exist, on problems he could never talk about. And mostly, he never did. Not to neighbors, not to friends, not even to much of his own family. For decades, he had carried a life full of secrets in silence, and that still wasn't the most surprising part. Before intelligence work, James had been an Olympic swimmer. He had represented Great Britain in 1968, and he had missed a medal by less than a second. Less than a second. One day he showed Priya the photographs. A young man in the pool in Mexico City, mid-stroke, focused, powerful. Priya sat there with her tea going cold, staring at those photos, trying to process what she was hearing. How many times had people walked past that house without ever wondering who was inside? How many extraordinary lives disappear simply because they go quiet? After that, Priya started bringing her daughter Anya on visits, and Anya loved James immediately. She climbed onto his lap, handed him books, and demanded stories. And James, who had spent years in silence, read to her in different voices until she burst out laughing. Every time she laughed, something in him seemed to come back. Priya noticed the changes little by little. The roses in the front garden were trimmed again. The curtains started opening in the mornings. And that's when Priya realized this was no longer just a kind gesture. It was changing him. Then one day she arrived and saw James outside talking to another neighbor, just standing there, in the daylight, part of the street again. Later he said something Priya never forgot. "I had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something." That's what makes this story hit so hard. Not just that James had been alone, but that he had almost accepted it, all because nobody knocked. James died 18 months after Priya first walked to his door with that tin of biscuits. But by then, he was no longer invisible. His funeral was small, but it was full. And Priya stood up to speak. She talked about tea. She talked about biscuits. She talked about the little girl who made him laugh again. She talked about the photographs of a young man frozen in an Olympic pool in Mexico City. And she talked about the code breaker who had lived just a few feet away from people who never knew who he really was. Then she said this: "He had the most incredible life I have ever heard of, and he almost took it all with him because nobody knocked." That's the part you can't shake, because this story was never just about James. It's about the people we pass every day without really seeing. The quiet neighbor, the old man behind the curtains, the person whose whole life could disappear without anyone ever asking a single question. We are surrounded by people with entire worlds behind their front doors. And sometimes all it takes to bring one of those stories back into the light is something very small. A few extra biscuits, a few spare minutes, one knock. And sometimes that one knock changes everything.